Hello everyone, Kibler here. Just got back from BlizzCon, and the whole event was super awesome with the World Championship and, of course, the reveal of the upcoming Hearthstone expansion, Mean Streets of Gadgetzan. And today, what I want to do is jump into talking about the cards and mechanics that have been revealed from that set so far. So let's go ahead and jump right in, and we're going to start with the gangs. The cards that belong to three different classes. We saw a few that were revealed, like the Lotus Agents, the Cabal Courier, and the Grime Street Informant, kind of the cycle of cards that belong to the three gangs that allow classes to discover cards from the other classes that are paired in those gangs. So first of all, I just want to talk generally about the gang mechanic, basically, that there are cards that are restricted to three classes. This is a new thing in Hearthstone. Up to this point, either cards were neutral or they belong to a specific class. And I think that this general design direction of having cards that are multi-class cards is a very good thing for Hearthstone, because I think that you ended up having kind of weird restrictions in deck building in that either something was only able to be used by a particular class and thus kind of cut off from being a possible option for a lot of others, or was just a general card that can be used in everything. And the latter, the cards that can be used in everything, leads to stuff like Piloted Shredder, Lotheb, Dr. Boom, cards that when they're good, the best neutral cards, very often tend to just show up all over the place. You know, the Sludge Belchers, the Ancient Healbots, the things that are largely irreplaceable because in many cases they're even more powerful than some of the class options for that given effect. So I like the fact that the gangs allow Blizzard to make cards that can be super cool, but aren't just restricted to being played in a single class. You know, like only warriors get Grom, but anyone in, say, a particular gang will get the leader of that gang, which allows for more options for deck building, which is one of the things that's just the most fun in Hearthstone, is being able to have a lot of options when you're building your decks. As for these three specific cards, the Grime Street Informant is a little weird to me because the Grimy Goons, from my understanding, with the Hunter, Paladin, Warrior, seem like kind of the thug gang, and yet they have the 1/1 for 2 as their Discover card. It seems like they would be the one that has the big, beefy Discover minion, like the Lotus Agents are, comparatively. But I do think that of these, the Grime Street Informer may just be the best of them, because it's kind of like a Novice Engineer or Loot Hooder type effect. It's basically something that gives you a card that you play early that can potentially interact with the board, that can give you some additional value later. We've actually seen Jeweled Scarab, which does something pretty similar to this. It's different than Jeweled Scarab in that it doesn't necessarily guarantee you the ability to have a curve moving into the 2 into 3 like Scarab does, but it could be powerful in that it can give you access to later game options, like you could discover a Grom, for instance, and that's obviously very, very powerful. The Cabal Courier, in my mind, seems like probably the next best of them, simply because the efficiency of what you're getting for the body. You don't really care that much about the body, but you're getting a relatively cheap Discover effect from the Courier, as opposed to Lotus Agent, which is pretty expensive. It costs 5. It is kind of similar to an Ethereal Conjurer, though you don't necessarily get access to things which synergize with your deck quite as consistently as you do with Ethereal Conjurer. And in many cases, we even saw Ethereal Conjurer kind of phased out largely in favor of Azure Drake, even in decks that are looking for that kind of effect with a bunch of extra spells. So I don't expect any of these to see a ton of play. I do think, as I mentioned, the Informant is the best of them. Worth noting that these are especially powerful alongside Bran. We've seen a ton of that recently, or at least I've played a ton of that sort of thing recently with Netherspite Historian. And Bran obviously synergizes best with cheaper Discover things, so you can do either more of them in the same turn, or do the Bran plus the Discover effect, the Battlecry effect, on a lower total of mana. So of these, the Grime Street Informant I expect to see the most play. But it's also worth noting that any of these have some interesting implications if you do have things like duplicate type effects. Any minion that generates additional value can have synergy with cards like that, or with the pandas that return the cards to your hand. And Again, generally the cheaper ones are the best with those because they're the easiest to combo with other cards just from a mana perspective. And it's also interesting that these can potentially give you access to cards outside of the purview of what your class usually gets. You know, Priest getting a Fireball, or a Hunter getting Shield Block, some kind of way to generate armor or something, can allow for some interesting dynamics in the way that games play out. And I expect that that is more likely to be a thing that comes up in, say, Arena than Constructed necessarily, just because of the efficiency level of these particular cards isn't necessarily great. But overall, I love the idea of the gangs. I'm actually was kind of sad to hear that it sounds like there's only going to be 9 of these cards. It looks like this cycle, one of the legendary minions, or the gang leader of each, and then an additional probably cycle going through them. Curious to see what they all turn out to be, and I kind of hope that we see more of this sort of thing in the future, because it does make, as I mentioned, deck building much more interesting when you have a lot of overlapping things you can try out doing. So, speaking of gang leaders, let's jump into what is one of the most exciting cards in the set, which is COS Aqus. This is another Reno style of card. Reno Jackson, of course, is still in Standard now. Important to recognize that the rotation for Standard doesn't take place until the first set released next year. So I've heard people saying, oh, you won't be able to play this with Reno. That's not true. COS Aqus will be available in the same Standard format as Reno Jackson, at least for the foreseeable future, until the next expansion release early next year. So, obviously, COS Aqus will go into many decks that also have Reno Jackson, because pretty powerful card to have in your singleton deck. I'm curious to see if this ends up being kind of a theme that we see explored more in either the other card we have in the Cabal or in the other classes that are in the Cabal, the Warlock, Mage, and Priest. Simply because the leader of this gang having a effect that cares about having no duplicate in your deck would seem to lead one to believe that this is a thing that these classes are going to do in this set. So I'm curious to see if we'll see more of this. But this card in particular, I think, is obviously super cool. And it clearly has the ability to do really, really powerful things. And the modularity of this card, the modality of this card, the ability to sort of build whatever you need at any given time is really, really effective, I think, in giving you a lot of options during a game. I think this will play very well in control-oriented decks. Obviously not something that's looking to go into aggressive decks. Certainly not a zoo card. Generally speaking, the singleton decks do tend to be more control-oriented anyway. But if you're playing a long game and you're in the late stages against control decks, you can make 10 mana cards that will potentially be extremely powerful. Amusingly, this card pairs pretty well with Cho'Gall. Though spending 10 mana and 10 life could be kind of scary, but if you do, have a Reno deck, you can Cho'Gall into your 10 mana spell from this, and then Reno the next turn and get huge, huge tempo swings. Could be kind of cool. Who knows? We haven't seen Cho'Gall really make much of an impact yet, but with the ability to have something like the spells that can come off of COS Aqus. There's, I think, something like 120, 130 combinations I heard. I don't know all of them just yet, so it'll be interesting to see what those end up being. But there are stuff like deal tons of damage to minions, summon big minions, drawing cards, resurrecting minions. There's a lot of things that can be very powerful in lots of situations. Though it is worth noting that because it's a discover effect for each stage of the COS Aqus spell, you discover either 1, 5, or 10 cost, then ability number 1, ability number 2. And there are enough options for the abilities that you're not guaranteed to get any particular one. So you can't just play your COS Aqus and then be guaranteed to be able to do something like clear the board with the spell that you get the following turn. So important to note there, certainly. But I'm very excited to play decks with COS Aqus, and I think that he's going to be a centerpiece of a lot of really cool and really interesting control decks moving forward in the expansion. Continuing on the theme of cards I'm excited about, let's look at the Priest cards. We'll start with the ones that I'm obviously very excited about, which are the Dragon Priest cards. So, Draconic Operative. This card is nuts. I've played a ton of Dragon Priest. I actually played Dragon Priest primarily in my only Priest Road to Legend last month, and Dragonfire Operative is kind of the sort of thing that deck really wants and needs. The deck needs a certain density of dragons, of course, because you need to be able to activate your synergies. And one of the dragons that you kind of find yourself forced to play is Azure Drake. And Azure Drake's like one of the most played cards in all of Hearthstone. It goes into tons of different decks. Part of the reason that's the case is because there's a lot of elements of it that are powerful. The fact that you draw a card when you play it, the fact that you get spell damage when it's on the field. But Priest doesn't really, Dragon Priest specifically, doesn't necessarily make great use out of those. For one, you don't really have much use for spell damage. At most, you tend to maybe have Holy Nova in your deck. And the Mondo combo of Azure Drake plus Holy Nova costs 10 mana, and that's pretty horrible. That's pretty inefficient to be able to actually power up your one damaging spell. You need to have the max mana crystals you can have in the game. And the card draw aspect is obviously pretty powerful, but you're sacrificing a lot to get those things which you don't care as much about. You actually, particularly as a priest, with the hero power of Heal 2, would love to have a larger, more stable body. And the 4/4 body of Azure Drake is not really something that competes very well on the board. Draconic Operative, though, 5/6, really outclasses pretty much everything at the 5-drop slot. And it's a dragon, and it has an upside of discovering a card from your opponent's deck. And now that, in many cases, when you're playing a Dragon Priest deck, can actually be better than drawing a card. For one, you can get access to effects that you don't necessarily have access to, like efficient removal for certain things, depending on what your opponent's playing. It's way better than the random effect of getting a card from Shifting Shade, which is kind of funny because Shifting Shade is an understated 4-drop with a Death Rattle. This is an overstated 5-drop with a Battle Cry. So it kind of goes to show how like under curve Shifting Shade is in some ways. Obviously, Shifting Shade works with N'Zoth, which can generate tons of resources in a long game. But it also sort of just shows how powerful Draconic Operative is in comparison. And the Draconic Operative can give you, those additional cards without the risk of fatiguing you. And Dragon Priest is interesting because it is a deck that can win the game via getting significant board presence and just, killing your opponent, but sometimes can just win the game via attrition and sometimes even via fatigue. It can definitely be a factor against some decks like, say, Control Warrior. And the fact that you're discovering to gain card advantage rather than drawing cards deeper into your deck is extremely powerful in terms of ensuring that you're not just going to draw through your deck and get fatigued out. One of the things that's kind of problematic for Priest getting card advantage in general, you're either reliant on the random effects from Thoughtsteal or you're reliant on conditional card draw like Northshire Cleric, which can either lead you to not actually being able to draw the cards because the clerics are unable to be around when you are able to heal minions, or you just can burn through your deck because you have cards dedicated to drawing other cards and powered shields and etc., etc. But Discovering prevents that fatigue possibility. So super powerful card and is really going to help Dragon Priest have a resurgence, I think. It's already a pretty powerful deck to begin with that I think people are underrating at this time. It's going to get a lot more powerful tools. Another one of those tools is Dragonfire Potion. Now, in some alternate timeline, this is like the kind of card that I would get to preview because it's, two things that I absolutely love. It's a Priest card, it's a Dragon card, it's, a mass removal effect that I think Priest really needs. It's kind of like a Light Bomb, but not quite as powerful against really big minions. Obviously, this isn't going to be good at clearing out boards of Arcane Giants like Light Bomb might be able to do, but it is way better at killing Stealthed Auctioneers or boards full of Stranglethorn Tigers that have been copied by Moonblade Warden, while preserving your own dragons on board. It is kind of unfortunate that the natural predator of priests, the Azure Drake or the Twilight Drake, are not able to be killed by this if you are up against an opponent who's using those. And Azure Drake is one of the most commonly played minions around, but there's just such upside from this. You don't have to play terrible cards like Holy Nova that are really bad in a lot of matchups when your opponents don't have lots of small minions. You can just totally cut that card from your deck. You can play this and, help incrementally kill those Arcane Giants, which Holy Nova basically doesn't do. But it is important to note, too, that even when you're playing Dragon Priest, you have a lot of non-dragon minions in your deck. You tend to have the Blackwing Corruptors, Blackwing Technicians, Bran, things like that. And you don't necessarily just one-sided board clear your opponent, but in the right circumstances, say you have some Draconid Operatives in play, you can just blow up your opponent's stuff and basically flame strike them for just 6 mana, and that's kind of outrageous. So definitely going to see a lot of Dragon Priest on the ladder, and many of them will be played by me. So big card that will certainly have an impact. Also just potentially in Control Priest. You can play a controlling Priest deck where this is kind of like your light bomb, and not necessarily have to play a bunch of weak sweepers. You can play, say your Excavated Evils or Holy Novas, and then play this, which gives you so many more tools that are good at clearing off things that the smaller removal can't. You potentially don't even need to play the Akanai Circle combo, which many people sort of feel like they had to play in so many situations with Priest just because you couldn't deal with a medium-sized board after Light Bomb was gone. So definitely a very important card for Priest, which I do think we'll see a lot more of in the future. So more Priest cards. Moving along, we have the Cabal Talon Priest, and it's kind of reminiscent of Dark Cultist, 3/4, 4/3, that has an ability that can give a minion +3 health. It's not quite the same, of course. I've seen people saying, "Oh, this is lame. It's just a worse or better Dark Cultist." It's neither. It's obviously very, very similar to Dark Cultist, and the ability I think is actually very important on this in terms of making Priest able to do what Priest wants to do, which is actually have a minion in play that you can use your healing on. And the Cabal Talon Priest is obviously very powerful if you are able to curve out and follow that up with a Talon Priest. There aren't very many early drops that you necessarily are going to be able to play in a Priest deck that you'll play, turn 1 or 2 into Cabal Talon Priest, at least that are popular right now. Lots of those minions are challenged too easily, like Northshire Cleric, for instance. It used to be great when there were a bunch of 2/1s around, but now that there are 1/3s and 3/4s for 1 and 2 mana, it's a lot harder to actually have any effective use of the Cleric and ensure that it can survive if you do play in the early turns. Talon Priest can help that, but you're not really necessarily gonna get a ton of value out of your Cleric that you play into your opponent coining out a Tunnel Trog, and then you Talon Priest it. You're able to get some reasonable board presence there sometimes, but it's not the dream. But what is the dream is having any kind of board presence, say Wormrust Agent or a Twilight Whelp that you can buff with this, and actually actively be able to pressure your opponent's board and use your hero power to pump your minions up. Kind of like a Velen's Chosen that doesn't give attack. That's one of the cards that was really crucial to a lot of Priest decks for a long time, was Velen's Chosen, the ability to actually ensure that your cheap minions remained relevant going into the middle and late stage of the game. Talon Priest doesn't allow you to do it in quite the same way because you can't just eat their minion on curve or up curve even, but it can ensure that your opponent isn't able to just easily get trades and allow them to basically circumvent your ability to use your hero power on your minions just by trading every stage of the game. So definitely a really powerful minion. As to exactly where it fits, does this outclass the Blackwing Technician? Probably not, in my mind, in Dragon Priest, because you don't necessarily always have an early play that you're able to get the boost on, and having the 3/5 is really relevant in a number of spots against, say, True Sword Champion, or against just incremental damage from a Tunnel Trog, Totem Golem, or Totem Golem plus Spirit Claws. There's the 5th point of health is a really big deal. So it'll be interesting to see where this does find a home, and I do think that it will go a long way to making tempo board-centric Priest decks more viable. All right, next we have Pint-Sized Potion. This is an interesting card that kind of fills the hole that Shrinkmeister left. Priest has had a bunch of cards that are good against minions of a certain attack, mostly certain attack or less. There's obviously Shadow Word Death that cares about certain attack or higher, but cards like Shadow Word Horror, Cabal Shadow Priest, Shadow Word Pain, these are all cards that care about weak minions. And with the departure of Shrinkmeister from standard with Goblins vs. Gnomes, you didn't really have any way to take advantage of a lot of those. You saw those cards largely sort of fall by the wayside, with the exception, of course, of Shadow Word Pain, which is just powerful against Totem Golems, so it's been great all along. But Pint-Sized Potion can allow you to utilize a lot of those cards much more effectively. The fact that it's -3 also significantly increases the range that you can hit with, say, Cabal Shadow Priest. And being able to Pint-Sized Potion Cabal Shadow Priest for cheaper mana than you could previously use the Shrinkmeister plus Cabal. It's actually also a really big deal. Like, you could very easily, Pintsized Potion, then Cabal your opponent's, say, thing from below, and that's a huge tempo swing. And it'll be interesting to see if this causes people to build decks that are using a lot of those low attack, specific attacking cards, like Shadowed Horror even. The Pintsized Potion plus Shadowed Horror does kind of offer the ability to clear almost any board. Everything that your opponent has that has 5 or less attack will end up dying, and that's a huge one-sided swing. It does obviously take 2 cards, but there's so many other things you could potentially combine Pint-Sized Potion with in order for it to be effective, that it's not like you're just playing this strict combination of cards in order to get that effect. So certainly a card that is interesting to try and build around, and powers up a lot of things that Priest currently has that have been sort of lacking in ways to synergize with. So excited to try and build decks with this as well. Next up, we have Potion of Madness. This is another of the cards that care about low attack. This one is obviously basically Shadow Madness, but it's Shadow Madness that hits something a little bit smaller and does so for a way lower cost. And this card is kind of insane. Shadow Madness you very often would just be using on 2 attack minions anyway, and just primarily using it to 2-for-1 your opponent by stealing their small minion, trading into their other small minion. And Potion of Madness, you can do that for just 1 mana, so you don't have to wait until later on for these like big tempo swings. Not only that, but Potion of Madness costing 1 is very relevant because Wild Pyromancer is such a popular card and powerful card in a lot of Priest decks because of obviously healing, because of Powered Shield. So the more cheap spells, and particularly cheap interactive spells, you're able to include in a Priest deck that can take advantage of Wild Pyromancer, kind of the better. So it is worth noting that Potion of Madness is more powerful but still more situational than, say, just Holy Smite. Holy Smite is 1-cost thing that can pretty consistently kill a cheap opposing minion, but doesn't have the super upside of possibly being able to 2-for-1 your opponent or get a lot of additional value. Potion of Madness is particularly strong right now against Hunter decks if they're using Kindly Grandmother, kind of the Shadow Madness on your Haunted Creeper sort of thing that was very, very powerful in the past. Has an even more swingy effect with Potion of Madness for just 1 mana on a Kindly Grandmother. If you're able to even just trade that off, and even trade it, even if you're just attacking at your opponent's minion and just stealing their, killing their thing, getting a 3/2 for 1 mana, that's pretty powerful. So it'll be interesting to see how aggressive decks look and if Potion of Madness does have a home. Because for instance, against say Tempo Mage, Potion of Madness is really weak because most of their deck consists of 3/2s. You can potentially Potion of Madness, say a Flame Waker, but Potion on a Babbling Book, Potion usually on a Mana Worm, not necessarily going to get a great thing to attack into it when it is only at 2 or less power. But it is also potentially very effective against Blood Mage Thalnos, which is a super popular card, and again does combine with the Pint-Sized Potion that we were talking about before, if you're looking to kind of go in on that style of effect. So definitely a very interesting card, definitely a card that gives Priest a lot of power against cheap aggressive minions if they're looking for it. I don't know, at least right now in the metagame, if this is a card that you would play, simply because there aren't that many great targets for it in a lot of aggressive decks. Obviously though, very, very good against Imp Gang Boss, all those sort of things in Zoo as well. If those are the decks that are very popular, this could be a very good card, but otherwise, could be tough to find a home. I guess now I'll talk about kind of the honorary Priest card, the Fel Orc Soul Fiend. This is an interesting card that's kind of reminiscent, of course, of Injured Blademaster. It's a 3-drop that damages itself, and it does so, though, in a way that is better for a lot of what Priest wants to do than Injured Blademaster. The problem with Injured Blademaster in a lot of situations is that it will just trade down because it has such low health the turn that you play it. You play your Blademaster, and unless you are able to heal it immediately with something like Circle of Healing, your opponent can trade, say, a 2-drop into it or kill it with Fiery War Axe or Spirit Claws, and you've lost a lot of tempo pretty much immediately. But with Fel Orc Soul Fiend, it damages itself periodically, damages itself over time. So you can kind of think of this as a tempo investment of your mana now that you have to continue to invest your mana later in to make good on. So if you think about it, this is essentially a 3/5 minion in terms of what your opponent has to do to get rid of it going into your turn. So if your opponent doesn't deal 5 damage to it on their turn, still live on your turn because it won't take damage. It'll be 3/7, take 2, etc. So if you're able to continue to invest mana in it later, you get a significant board presence now, which is very valuable to a priest deck that's looking to wrest control of the early board in a game against an aggressive deck, or even kind of a mid-range deck like, say, mid-range Shaman. Having a minion that's difficult for them to kill easily with, say, Lightning Bolt or Spirit Claws can be very, very powerful, even if you do have to continue to invest mana in it over turns. It's also worth noting that this is a good way to trigger things that care about healing. One thing that you can kind of have a problem with in a priest deck is you actually need to have your things damaged in order to get your heal triggers, like, say, with Northshire Cleric. Sometimes you just sit with Northshire Cleric in your hand and have nothing to heal with it, so it's kind of rotting. And Feluric Soul Fiend is kind of another Injured Blade Master in that sense as well, because it can give you effectively an enabler for your heal triggers by damaging itself. So I think this is actually a pretty powerful card. It's obviously not a priest card, but it kind of feels like it might as well be a priest card because you do need to be able to heal it to take advantage of it in any significant sense. But I think that if you can, this can be very, very powerful. And I do think that this can potentially give priest decks even more options for those early turns if they do care about that healing effect.